What if the quiet man in the wrinkled coat, ignored at the gate, doubted by the crew, wasn't just a passenger, but the one person who could turn an entire airline upside down? This isn't a story about revenge. It's about dignity, power, and a lesson no classroom ever taught. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Thaddeus Merrick walked through the automatic doors of Eastbourne Regional Airport with the steady pace of a man who never felt the need to rush. The chill of early autumn clung to the Denver air, brushing past his worn brown coat like an old friend. He carried a simple leather satchel, scuffed at the corners, the strap softened by years of use. Inside were a few books, a yellow legal pad, and a first-class boarding pass tucked neatly in a front pocket. He didn't look like he belonged in first class. Not in the way people usually thought of it. No tailored suit, no leather briefcase, no watch that whispered status. His shirt was clean but faded, his khakis creased but not pressed, and his silver hair combed but not sculpted. His gait was even and relaxed, but his eyes, gray and steady, took in everything. He moved like someone who had spent a lifetime watching without drawing attention, like a teacher used to standing at the back of a classroom just to see who was really paying attention. He paused at a small cafe near his gate, Nora's table. The name reminded him of a former colleague from his teaching days, and the scent of brewed coffee and toasted sourdough lured him in. He ordered black coffee and sat by the window, pulling out his notepad. Across the waiting area, he noticed a young family. Two kids, a frazzled mom, and a father juggling strollers and carry-ons. A gate agent stopped them, pointing at their oversized duffel. Her voice wasn't cruel, but there was a sharpness to it. Rules, weight limits, tags. Thaddeus didn't hear the exact words, but he caught the tone, the kind that turned help into reprimand. He opened his pad and scribbled something quickly. Tone dictates power more than titles do. It wasn't the first time he'd seen this. He remembered a student, Darius, bright, respectful, always early to class. Darius had saved up for a flight to a scholarship interview, showed up in his work clothes, and was told by a flight attendant he didn't match the profile for business class. They bumped him to the back. Thaddeus had carried that story with him for years. It stuck to his ribs like a heavy meal he never digested. Today he wasn't flying to visit family. He wasn't heading to a conference. He was here for something more subtle, something quieter. The boarding gate lit up with a soft chime. First-class passengers for Viajet Flight 2197 to New York, now boarding. The voice was smooth, efficient, just impersonal enough to suggest professionalism. Thaddeus stood, slung the strap of his bag over his shoulder, and walked toward the gate. A tall woman in a Navy uniform stepped forward. Her name tag read Rhea. She was poised, hair pulled tightly into a bun, posture sharp like the crease on her slacks. As Thaddeus approached the priority boarding lane, she stepped into his path. "Excuse me, sir," she said coolly. "This lane is for first-class passengers." He offered her a small, polite smile and reached into his coat. "Yes, I believe I'm in the right place." He handed her the boarding pass. Rhea barely glanced at it before looking back at him, her brow subtly lifting. "Please wait over there," she said, motioning toward a nearby row of empty seats. "We need to verify something." "Of course," Thaddeus replied, his voice even. She didn't say what needed verifying. She didn't ask for identification. She just turned and walked back to her post. A few passengers in line behind him shifted awkwardly. One man in a business suit leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered something. She gave a tight, sympathetic smile and glanced at Thaddeus with the kind of look people reserve for someone who might be lost or confused. Thaddeus stepped aside and sat, resting his bag at his feet. His hands rested on his knees, calm. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look inconvenienced. But his gaze followed Rhea, not with hostility, but with quiet scrutiny. She reminded him of some of his students from years past. Smart, driven, but eager to show control. People often believed authority came from standing taller or speaking sharper. He had spent decades teaching otherwise. From a nearby counter, a baggage handler leaned toward Rhea and spoke quietly, his voice half lost beneath the airport hum. "Hey," he said, "did you hear? There's some bigwig flying incognito today. New stakeholder or something. I think one of the board members, older guy, wears regular clothes. Rhea blinked, looking momentarily puzzled. That true? She asked, skepticism creeping in. That's the word, the handler shrugged. They said he looks like someone you wouldn't expect. Rhea glanced back toward the seated figure of Thaddeus Merrick. She frowned, then quickly shook her head. Someone like that? She murmured. Number can't be. She turned back to her clipboard, tightening her grip just slightly, as if willing the conversation to disappear. Thaddeus didn't move. He just looked out past the gate windows, watching a plane taxi toward the runway, its wings catching the morning light like silver arms stretching wide. He had spent a lifetime teaching people to read between the lines. Now it was his turn to see who was really paying attention. Thaddeus Merrick sat quietly near gate 14, his satchel resting between his shoes. The seat beneath him was molded plastic, cold even through his khakis, but he didn't fidget. He just sat there, back straight, hands folded on his lap like he was waiting for a class to settle before a lesson. Around him, the airport buzzed gently with life, voices rising and falling, wheels of carry-ons humming across tile, overhead announcements flickering in and out. No one seemed to notice him anymore, which suited him just fine. He watched a young man struggle with a coffee lid at a nearby table, spilling a few drops onto his sleeve. The man winced and dabbed at the stain like it offended more than his appearance. A couple in their 60s bickered softly about boarding zones. A toddler flung a snack pouch into the air with the careless joy only toddlers possess. Thaddeus took it all in. His eyes lingered not out of judgment, but habit. It was the same way he used to watch students take their seats, looking for the ones who slouched with boredom, who avoided eye contact, who glanced at the clock too early. There was always something to be learned in how people waited. His gaze drifted down to his hands. The veins stood out more these days, and the skin bore the story of time. He flexed his fingers slowly, thinking, not of now, but of before. He saw the narrow hallways of Fairbrook High School again, the smell of chalk and old paper, the way voices echoed after final bell. 38 years he spent there. Some days felt like lectures, others like battles. But every day, it felt like purpose. And then there was Darius, a boy who showed up to class every day with oil on his fingernails and a brain sharp enough to quote Baldwin by heart. He worked evenings at a machine shop and took care of his little brother. One time, Thaddeus had given him a worn copy of Invisible Man. Darius had finished it in 2 days and came back asking for more. Years later, Darius emailed him. He'd earned a scholarship interview out east. First time on a plane. He had saved up and bought a ticket for business class. But he wore his work clothes, dark coveralls, name patch on the chest, because that was what he had. They moved him to coach. The explanation? Appearance didn't align with the cabin environment. Darius didn't raise his voice. He just nodded, took the downgrade and said, I didn't want trouble. But when Thaddeus heard the story, it settled in his gut like wet concrete. He had spent his life teaching dignity. And somehow dignity was still a dress code. That memory didn't fade. It hardened. That was the moment Thaddeus began looking into the structure, the investors, the board. And when the opportunity came, he didn't hesitate to buy in. Not for money, not for clout, but for one simple reason. No one else was going to fix what they couldn't see. He looked up as Rhea Langford returned, holding a tablet in her hand. I'm sorry, she said, still formal. We're not seeing a record of your first-class booking in the system. He reached into his coat, pulled out the same boarding pass and handed it over once more. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to her screen. Her jaw tensed just slightly. It could be a system error, she offered. I'll have someone from security take a look. Please stay seated until then. Thaddeus gave her a faint smile. Not mocking, not cold, just a little tired. You know, he said gently, I spent a good part of my life helping young folks sort out logic from assumption. I wonder how many people ever took the time to do the same for you. Her eyes narrowed just a little, not out of anger, more like discomfort. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised her radio and called for a supervisor. Across the concourse, a Virejet technician named Paul walked past, half focused on a maintenance request, when his eyes landed on the man sitting calmly beneath the gate sign. He paused. He'd seen that face. There had been an internal email the night before, something about a new strategic investor, arriving unannounced as part of a low-profile observation initiative. No red carpet, no entourage, just a quiet visit. Paul leaned toward his colleague. "Hey, isn't that the guy from the email? The one they said might show up today?" His colleague shrugged. "Maybe. I didn't read the whole thing. Just saw a new board member and moved on." Paul frowned, uncertain. He pulled out his phone and sent a short message to his floor manager, just in case. The gears of rumor started to spin, quietly. Back at the gate, a few passengers noticed Thaddeus was still waiting. A woman looked at him, then whispered to her partner. A man in a pressed shirt glanced over and made a face. "Looks more like someone sleeping in the terminal than flying first class," he muttered. Thaddeus heard it. He wasn't far away. Still, he didn't move. He didn't bristle or glare. He simply looked toward Rhea, who was typing something into her tablet now. This time, he didn't look like a man waiting for a mistake to be fixed. He looked like someone measuring a moment, weighing it in silence, and letting it speak louder than he ever could. On the second floor of Eastbourne Regional's main terminal, behind a wall of tinted glass and chrome trim, Wesley Drummond sat at a sleek conference table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The monitors before him showed real-time flight data, staffing logs, and a live feed of various gates. But his attention wasn't on any of them. His tablet vibrated twice. He tapped the screen lazily, expecting another update on boardroom scheduling or quarterly forecast delays. Instead, the subject line caught his eye. Urgent, strategic stakeholder presence. Gate 14. His brow furrowed. The email was from legal counsel. He skimmed the content. Mr. Thaddeus Merrick, strategic shareholder, has been confirmed present at Eastbourne Regional Airport. Identity is not to be disclosed publicly per his request. Kindly ensure all staff interactions adhere to the high-level customer respect protocol. Attached was a photo, fuzzy, clearly taken from a distance, but unmistakable. The same silver hair, the worn coat, the thin frame sitting calmly by the window. Wesley exhaled slowly, lips tight. "So, the old man's really here," he muttered. He set the tablet down, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His voice was just above a whisper. "Old, out of step, and wants to teach us all how to be kinder?" He let the sarcasm linger in the room. The idea annoyed him more than it should have. He'd seen Merrick's name pop up in recent board updates. Quiet but influential. Someone who had bought in, not with loud promises, but with quiet insistence on structural reform. He'd called it dignity-first investment. Wesley had rolled his eyes at that phrase more than once. The message said to ensure he was treated properly, but that meant acknowledging who he was. Wesley stared at the screen for a moment longer, then issued a quiet order to his assistant. "Don't do anything. Let it play out." He leaned back in his chair. If the man got frustrated enough, maybe he'd walk. Maybe he'd reconsider this whole messianic mission to fix an airline by changing how we look at people. Better to let him go home feeling unheard than give him a microphone. Down at Gate 14, the plan was already moving. A pair of security officers, one in uniform and the other in plain clothes, approached Thaddeus where he still sat. Rhea stood nearby, arms folded, eyes cool but curious. "Sir," one of the officers began politely, "we've had some confusion regarding your boarding class. To avoid delaying the flight, we're going to ask that you step aside for a few moments. We just want to clear something up." Thaddeus stood slowly, not grudgingly, but with a calm that somehow made everyone else seem hurried. "I see," he said. Rhea didn't speak, but her face said enough. A kind of restrained satisfaction. She believed she'd acted properly, by the book. And for her, that was enough. But Thaddeus didn't turn away quietly this time. Before taking a step, he looked at the two officers and then at Rhea. "You don't need to know who I am," he said, "but you should know this. Some of us stay quiet because we're watching, not because we're weak. That's worth remembering." His voice wasn't loud, but it held weight, enough to still a few conversations nearby, enough to make Rhea's eyebrows twitch, just briefly. The officers glanced at each other, clearly unsure. But orders were orders. They gently motioned for him to follow, and he did. He passed the gate slowly, walking back toward the general waiting area. As he did, his eyes landed on a large advertisement board, mounted high on the wall. It was a full-spread poster for Virejet. A smiling flight attendant held a tray of drinks. Behind her, happy passengers leaned back in plush seats. The slogan was written in bold silver letters beneath, "We put people first." Thaddeus stopped and looked up at it. He stood there for several seconds, long enough that a child tugged at her mother's sleeve to point at him. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood, eyes locked on those words. He felt a quiet hollowness open up in his chest. His mind drifted, not to anger but to something older. A moment decades earlier, in a classroom lit by buzzing ceiling lights. He had stood before 30 seniors, holding a piece of chalk, asking, "When is it hardest to be kind?" A boy in the third row, Jerome, he remembered, had raised his hand slowly and said, "When people treat you like you don't matter." Thaddeus had nodded then. He nodded now, too. It was one of those lessons that never really aged. Behind him, unnoticed by most, a young baggage staffer stood near the vending machines, phone in hand. He had been watching the scene from afar, had seen the exchange, heard the quiet dignity in the old man's voice. He snapped a picture, zooming in on Thaddeus just before he turned. Then he texted the photo to his supervisor with a short message. "This is him, right?" A minute later, the phone buzzed back. "Confirm. That's Merrick. Pass this to HQ." Miles Brennan, the director of business strategy, was already halfway across the terminal when his phone lit up. He stopped mid-step, jaw tightening. He stared at the image. His voice dropped into a whisper. "Damn it, it's really him?" Thaddeus Merrick sat at the far end of the waiting area, where the polished floor met the wide windows. His boarding pass, still valid, lay tucked inside a dog-eared copy of A Man for All Seasons. The book rested open in his lap, his thumb marking a passage he'd read a dozen times before. But his eyes weren't on the words anymore. Across the terminal, Miles Brennan moved briskly through the crowd. He wasn't the kind of man who usually broke a sweat, but his forehead shone under the fluorescent lights. His blazer was slightly wrinkled from sitting in a car too long, and his tie had loosened just a touch. He scanned the gate area until his eyes landed on Thaddeus. He hesitated, just a moment, then walked forward. "Mr. Merrick," he said quietly, stopping in front of him, I want to apologize. Things have clearly gone too far." Thaddeus looked up, calm as ever. "Too far?" he repeated, voice soft. "Or just far enough to reveal what needed seeing?" Miles shifted his weight. He'd prepared a half-dozen responses in the car, but none of them felt right now. There was something disarming about Thaddeus, not in a rehearsed way, but in the way someone becomes comfortable with silence. It was the kind of composure that didn't challenge with volume, but with stillness. "I can escort you back to first class," Miles offered. "We'll use a side entrance. Discreet. You won't have to deal with any more." "No." Thaddeus held up a hand, not harshly, just firmly. "I don't need a special door. I need to be able to walk through the regular one, without being sized up before my foot even crosses the carpet." Miles said nothing. People around them moved in waves, pulling luggage, sipping coffee, scrolling phones. But for a moment, their corner of the airport felt like a quieter world. Thaddeus closed the book in his lap, placed it back in his bag. "If a system is broken," he continued, "you can't study its flaws from the penthouse. You've got to sit where the cracks form. Feel them under your feet." "You really want to stay here?" Miles asked, still surprised. "I want to see how it plays out," Thaddeus said, "without titles, without corrections." As it is then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Don't interfere again." Miles nodded, not in defeat, more like someone understanding a lesson halfway through the lecture. He turned, started walking back through the terminal, phone already vibrating again. Thaddeus remained seated a moment longer, then rose slowly and made his way toward the restroom. His legs had stiffened some, but he moved with purpose. Inside, the tiled walls reflected cool light from overhead. The sinks hummed quietly. He turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over his hands before splashing some on his face. The mirror stared back with familiar honesty. Wrinkles had deepened over the years. The gray in his hair had overtaken the brown long ago. His skin, once taut from chalkboard lectures and lunchtime debates, had softened, lined with memory. He looked at himself for a long while. "What am I doing here?" he asked the mirror, not to hear an answer, but to feel the weight of the question. Was it just about Darius, the student who'd been turned away because of a uniform and a pair of worn boots? Was it about all the other faces in his memory, students who'd learned to think critically but still had to beg for the same respect others were handed? Or was it something deeper, a quiet fear that what he had spent a lifetime teaching, dignity, clarity, human worth, had become obsolete? He remembered his final day at Fairbrook High. The gym had been decorated with paper streamers. The faculty gave him a plaque. But what stuck with him was a gift from a small group of seniors, a wooden slate, painted to look like a blackboard, with a hand-lettered quote. He paused. Eyes watched him now with full attention. Today I was told, indirectly, that I didn't belong either. I was asked to step aside. Quietly, respectfully, yes. But asked all the same. No yelling, no threats, just a presumption that I was out of place. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. One man lowered his phone. Another woman closed her laptop screen. I've spent my life believing that character should be measured by action, not appearance. And yet here I was, holding a legitimate ticket, dressed in everyday clothes, and still, I was stopped. He looked over at Rhea, who stood stiff near the cockpit. His expression didn't accuse, but it held weight. I don't want your apologies, he continued. I want your reflection. I want you to ask yourselves, what would it feel like to be removed from a space you paid for, not because of who you are, but because of who you don't look like? A stillness fell over the cabin, not discomfort exactly, something deeper. A woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "He's right. I didn't say anything when it happened. I just watched." Thaddeus offered a faint nod, then took a breath. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to remind you that dignity doesn't come with a seat number. It doesn't wear tailored suits or click designer heels. It walks quietly. It observes. And sometimes it speaks up. Then came the interruption. Wesley Drummond stepped through the partition. His usual composure looked tighter now, more forced than natural. He strode forward and addressed Thaddeus directly, voice clipped. Mr. Merrick, I'm going to have to ask you to conclude. You're disrupting the cabin experience. Before Thaddeus could answer, a voice rose from the second row. Disrupting? An elderly woman said, her tone firm but calm. He's the first person who's made sense all morning. Another voice chimed in, younger this time, from the aisle. Isn't he a shareholder? The young man asked. If he has a stake in this airline, doesn't he have a right to speak? Wesley hesitated. He glanced around. The room he usually controlled, had turned on him. Not aggressively, but undeniably. He no longer held the weight in the air. That weight belonged to someone else now. Thaddeus turned to Rhea once more. You did what you thought was right, he said. His voice had softened. I get that, but in this job, and in life, thinking right isn't enough. You've got to feel it. You've got to know when a rule is just a disguise for fear. Rhea's eyes glistened, and she looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know you were. You don't need to, he interrupted gently. You just need to know how to see people better next time. With that, he handed the mic back. Passengers didn't clap, but several nodded. Some reached for their drinks with a kind of reverence, as though something solemn had passed between them all. The captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing final clearance in a smooth flight path. Flight attendants resumed positions. The plane began its slow crawl toward the runway. Thaddeus returned down the aisle, but instead of reclaiming his first-class seat, he settled back into 17D. By choice this time. The view from the window hadn't changed, but his place in the cabin, his choice to be seen and to see others clearly, felt more solid than any assignment on paper. The plane had leveled off above the clouds, a silent glide through the evening sky. The seatbelt sign had clicked off, and a few passengers stirred, reaching for drinks, adjusting headrests. But in seat 17D, Thaddeus Merrick remained still. He stared out the window, watching a soft trail of pink light fade into the approaching dusk. He looked at peace, but peace tonight was not his destination. From the front of the cabin, Wesley Drummond appeared again. This time there was no pretense of diplomacy in his stride. His face held the kind of tension that doesn't show up on press photos, but festers in rooms where power is threatened. He moved past the curtain, past the other passengers, and stopped beside Thaddeus's seat. "Let's talk," Wesley said, his voice low, controlled, but every word tight as wire. Thaddeus looked up but said nothing. Wesley leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "You pulled off a great little performance, got the sympathy, the applause, maybe even a few new fans." He paused. "But you don't understand what you've set in motion." Thaddeus tilted his head slightly, eyes calm. Wesley continued, "You want to overhaul the entire training program? Retrain thousands of people? Redefine internal policies? It sounds noble, but it's not cheap. The costs, the logistics. You're risking the dividends of every investor in this company." Thaddeus folded his hands on his lap, unmoved. "You're gambling with real livelihoods," Wesley went on, "and you don't have unilateral authority, no matter how many people clap for you." Then came the interruption Thaddeus had been waiting for. Without a word, he reached down and removed a slim manila envelope from his satchel. He opened it, pulled out a stapled packet, and handed it to Wesley. Wesley's eyes scanned the top sheet, a certified document from the most recent board session. He flipped to the final page. 3 signatures at the bottom, unmistakable. 3 voting members. Approval sealed. "You're not alone in this," Wesley said slowly. "No," Thaddeus replied, voice even. "Not anymore." For a long second, neither man moved. Around them, the cabin remained hushed, though a few curious glances turned their way. But it wasn't about spectacle now. This was something deeper, quieter. "I didn't come here to win," Thaddeus said. "That's the mistake you made, thinking this was about leverage. I came here to see if anyone still remembered what it feels like, to be looked down on and decide not to stay down." Rhea sat 3 rows up. She had remained silent for much of the flight, but now her shoulders trembled ever so slightly. She wiped her cheek quickly, hoping no one noticed. But Thaddeus had. He didn't speak to her, but the smallest smile passed through his eyes like a thank you whispered without sound. A man sitting behind Rhea leaned forward and rested a hand gently on Thaddeus's shoulder. No words, just that. And from the front row, a white-haired gentleman, elegant in dress but worn in years, turned to his wife and said, "We need more men like him, not just in boardrooms, in decisions that matter." Wesley said nothing. His mouth tightened. He took a step back, then another, until he stood by the cabin divider. He leaned one hand against the wall for support, the other clenched around the edge of the document. His eyes flickered, not with anger, but with uncertainty. In his silence, something cracked. A memory surfaced, uninvited but firm. His father, wearing a faded blue postal uniform, standing at the entrance of a steakhouse, turned away at the door. "You don't look like our usual clientele," the hostess had said. Wesley had been 14. He'd watched his father's face harden, jaw tight. But they'd left, quietly. Dignity walked away that day, but never disappeared. Now Wesley stood, fingers tight on the cabin rail, breathing shallow. No one saw that memory but him. No one heard the sound it made when it finally came back. Meanwhile, Thaddeus pulled his phone from his coat pocket. The screen lit up. He tapped an email draft already half-written to Miles Brennan. Subject: Phase 1, respect. First body launch immediately at Eastbourne, Chicago West, and Raleigh, Maine. Full coordination with HR and PR. Staff sign-up begins next Monday. He scrolled down and tapped CC all board members. Then, before hitting send, he typed one final line at the bottom. Education is not about knowing more. It's about understanding better. He tapped send. The message was on its way before the plane even crossed Missouri airspace. Thaddeus looked back out the window. The sun had dipped fully below the clouds now, but its light lingered. Sometimes the real shift doesn't come from above. It starts the moment someone chooses to stop looking down. The wheels touched down on the tarmac at JFK, just as the sky turned to a watercolor wash of orange and pale lavender. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the runway, and the cabin filled with the subtle, collective exhale of travelers who had finally arrived. Phones flicked on, seatbelts unbuckled, the usual rustling. Thaddeus Merrick didn't rush to stand. He remained seated for a moment, watching the slow procession of light crawl across the cabin wall. He closed his eyes briefly, not from fatigue, but from a kind of quiet settling inside him. Something had shifted, and not just in others. When he did rise, it was without fanfare. He reached for his bag, checked his pocket for the folded boarding pass, and stepped into the aisle. Near the exit door, Rhea Langford stood in uniform, posture formal but softer than it had been earlier in the day. She didn't speak at first, just gave a small nod, her hands clasped in front of her. Her voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. I want to say I'm sorry." Thaddeus paused beside her, not out of surprise but out of intent. He looked at her, not past her, not through her. "I don't hold anger toward you," he said gently, "but I hope next time you'll look a little closer and see more than what someone's wearing." She nodded, blinking fast. "I will," she said, barely audible. Thaddeus gave her shoulder a light pat, not as a reward, not as approval, as a beginning. Then he stepped off the plane. Days passed. At the Virejet corporate office, a long mahogany table stretched across the executive conference room. Wesley Drummond sat at one end, arms crossed, expression tight. Across from him, the board chair spoke evenly. "The vote stands. You're still CEO for now, but training oversight is being transferred, effective immediately." Wesley opened his mouth to protest, but the chair raised a hand. "You had your chance. The numbers speak for themselves. 71% support. This isn't about drama anymore. It's about credibility." The papers slid across the table, signed, sealed. The Respect First initiative would launch under Thaddeus Merrick's direction. Wesley rose from the table, jaw clenched. As he left the room, he walked past the hallway gallery, portraits of former company leaders, plaques of milestones. But one photo caught him. It was new. Thaddeus, seated among a circle of young students, chalk in hand, caught mid-laugh. Below the photo, "True value doesn't need proof. It just needs presence." Wesley looked at it for a long moment. Then he walked on. 1 month later, a modest building opened on the east side of Eastbourne Regional Airport. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no grand opening banners, just a simple brass plaque by the door. Respect First Training Center. Inside, rows of chairs held newly hired attendants in neat uniforms. Some looked nervous, others curious. A facilitator stood at the front, ready to begin the morning's orientation. In the back row, Thaddeus Merrick sat quietly. White shirt, plain khakis, the same satchel by his feet. He wasn't there to lead the session. He was there to observe. A young trainee turned around and whispered, "Is he the main instructor?" Someone else answered before Thaddeus could. "Number, he's the guy who made this place possible." Thaddeus smiled but said nothing. Halfway through the presentation, the trainer posed a question. "What's one way we misjudge people without realizing it?" Hands went up. Real answers came. Some thoughtful, some raw. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees lining the lot. No cameras, no headlines. Just the steady hum of change, starting from the inside out. That night, on a local channel, a quiet story aired. It was only 3 minutes long. A retired literature teacher sparked change across one of the nation's top airlines, not with a lawsuit or outrage, but by standing firm in what he believed. His lesson? Dignity doesn't demand attention. It just needs a place to be seen. In a small apartment just outside Philadelphia, Darius watched the clip twice. Then he opened his laptop and wrote, "Dear Mr. Merrick, you probably don't remember the kid in coveralls who got bumped to the back, but I never forgot you. What you did, this whole thing, you didn't just speak for me. You gave all of us a little bit of dignity back. I'm proud to say I was one of your students. Sincerely, Darius Henderson." That evening, at Nora's table, the same quiet airport cafe where this all began, Thaddeus sat by the window with a cup of black coffee and the email open on his phone. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he pulled out his notebook, the same one from that morning flight. He flipped to the back page and scribbled one last line. "A lesson doesn't need a blackboard, but it sure needs a heart." He closed the notebook, folded his hands around the coffee, and watched the runway glow under the soft haze of sunset. Some lessons don't need a classroom or a blackboard, just someone brave enough to speak when others stay silent. Thaddeus Merrick didn't change the world with anger or titles, but with quiet conviction and the courage to remind us. Respect should never depend on appearance. What would our world look like if we all chose to see each other a little more clearly? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are on the way. Real, human, and worth hearing.